the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 84.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and today we have back on Dr. Paul Sullivan. If you've missed him before, we'll link to those shows in the show notes so you can check them out. Always has insightful stuff, and we talk about energy security and the threats that face the U.S. and abroad. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Paul Sullivan. Well, Dr. Sullivan, it's great to have you on again today. How are you doing, sir?
Okay, it's great to be back.
Well, we always love having you on and appreciate your time, so thanks for doing it. Let's get into it. I think we were talking offline here. We kind of, the last time or two times ago you were on, we talked about, threats that are facing the energy industry. You've got domestic threats, you've got foreign threats. Let's just kind of step back and say, just from the U.S. standpoint, what are some of the big threats that we're looking at for the energy industry?
Well, we can look at one right now that's happening in Houston, the flooding. And those huge rains, which are unbelievable, comparing history. And people in Texas listening to this know all about it. Changing weather is what this administration is calling it, otherwise known as climate change. Change in rain patterns. I don't think Houston has seen this in probably centuries. And they've had to shut down some of the refineries, as you know, and also the port itself has been shut for a bit. And this kind of rain can hurt petrochemicals industry, even the LNG industry. Pipelines could be damaged from this. I actually saw a picture of a shark going down one of the highways in Houston. And that's pretty outrageous. The last time something like this happened was the people opening up the refineries near New Orleans and in that part of Louisiana. A couple of the guys walked into the control station to find alligators inside of them. Water and weather are big risks, and the Department of Energy here in the U.S. has done a big study on this, actually many studies on this. Potential water issues, not only flooding, but also droughts. When there's not enough water to cool an electricity generating facility or to handle the water needs of a refinery, you can't run them. They're non-operable. And this has happened here with nuclear stations and refineries. It's actually happened globally. Internally, we have a growing problem of a rift in our society. I'm not sure where this is going. But there are certain violent people who don't like the government, don't like industry and all of that. I certainly hope they don't go kinetic, because that could really throw things off. But one example of this is the attack on the substation near San Francisco. Pretty good snipers were at many, many hundreds of yards shooting out the wires. You have to be well trained to do that. So there are human and natural threats. Earthquakes are threats as well. You can't do much about that, nor can you do much about climate change. Also threats in this country are the old infrastructure. Much of our electricity infrastructure is quite old. All of our nuclear plants are very old. Many of our coal and gas plants are old, but some of the gas plants are quite new because we're supplanting coal with gas. Some of the oil pipelines are old. Gas pipelines are old. There was an example of the problems that could result from the old gas pipelines in San Bruno, California, a few years ago, when one of the pipelines burst and there was a big flame coming up in a neighborhood. But the way that we can shut these pipelines down didn't work with that pipeline. It was too old, so they had to send out some retired people with these big wrenches who knew how to shut them manually. I could talk about the risk to energy in this country alone for the next 15 hours, and we wouldn't even touch upon it.
Well, yeah. So let me hop in there because you've covered a lot of ground. I guess you're talking about the was that the Metcalf sniper attack that you were mentioning a minute ago? Okay,
that's right.
Okay. So I want to talk about the water now. For the listeners' benefit, we're recording this on Monday the 28th, which is the waters are still rising. So we don't have all the data in to kind of analyze what the impact will be. But let's just kind of do a little forecasting here. Are you more concerned when you think of this flooding? Is the flooding getting in and ruining the machinery at the facilities, or are you worried about it getting in and mixing with the supply and the storage rather and messing that up? Or what is your biggest concern with the flooding aspect?
Well, getting in with the feedstock and the end refinery resources is probably not going to happen unless there's a break in the system. but ruining the mechanism and shutting down the electricity. A lot of electricity is needed to run a refinery. And if a flood shuts down that electricity for whatever reason, the refinery kind of gums up in some instances, and it could take some time to ungum it and to get it going again. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But also the pressure of the water, and water is heavy. Try to lift a gallon of water. That's pretty heavy stuff. Now think about a kilometer cube of water or a mile cubed of water pressuring on things in the Houston port. Obviously, it's not going to be a mile cubed on top of pressure of the moving water as well. Even if it's just rain, it moves. Another concern is, what is this doing to the channel in Houston, which is thin to begin with? What do these winds do to it? It's not exactly a rocky channel. It's more sandy if you take a look at the pictures. But the control mechanisms could also be damaged from the rain getting inside of the control rooms. The control rooms are often at below sea level, or at sea level, or if at best a little over sea level. And the pictures I'm seeing out of Houston, and I think the 110 highway, it looks like Venice.
Right.
This is really an unusual event, and I don't think anyone really knows what the results could be to the mechanisms or to other aspects of the energy industry. My hope is, and my gut feeling is, they'll be able to recover from this. Actually, I plan to visit there in next May. Certainly by then, everything will be back in line. Energy companies are pretty good at recovery. But there are also a whole bunch of ships offshore, kind of waiting there. What are we going to do? The oil markets, and to add to that, the gasoline markets are going to be thrown off. I was away for a while and came back and took a look at my local gas station prices, and they went up about 10 cents. Which I think is excessive, but this is Washington, and everything here is excessive. And I'm not sure what's happening where you are, but I would expect that the price of gasoline will go up as people realize how much damage possibly could have occurred and how long it will take to get back on the line here. Natural gas pipelines may be less affected, but again, this is an unusual circumstance. We're really not sure what's going to result here. My guess is it'll just start pumping and everything will be moving like before. But if you have that much water on the ground in Houston, you really can't produce a lot of electricity to move that oil and natural gas. You pretty much have to do the safe move and shut some of that stuff down. And also the workers can't get to work. Resourcing the oil and gas industry also involves people, and if they can't get out of their houses because their first floor turned into a swimming pool, that will slow down the industry's performance.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the channel there. I don't know, I haven't heard any reports out of Houston area, but I do know in Corpus Christi there's a report that I think it's a tugboat sank today, and so those reports are still early on. So as you know how that stuff goes, you hear stuff and it changes. But there is a report at least one ship in Corpus Christi in the channel there that did go down, and so you could see stuff like that, like you were referring to, which changes the dynamics because you kind of have, if you look at the EIA, they release their storage reports and other indicators. One of the things that they talk about is the efficiency of the refineries, and so you can imagine now they operate, I think it's like 90, 92% efficient. They're pretty efficient unless there's some kind of retooling going on. And so the next few weeks, the reports are really going to look a lot different, I'd imagine, because of all this rain and the flooding that's going on.
Of course, they're not going to be operating like before. And that tugboat sinking, I'd have to know exactly what caused that. But sometimes for boats and ships in rain like this, the pumps can't keep up with it.
Yeah, I just saw a headline said it broke away from the dock and it sank. I didn't get into the full article.
Well, it could have been an old rust bucket too. But what I was going to say is that a boat's pump is usually there in order to pump water out in place. There's a hole in the bottom, not water pouring in very rapidly from the top. The pump usually is in the bilge, not at the top of the boat. So I wonder how many other boats are being damaged from this. But also, with the amount of water that's out there, the entire channel has been thrown off. It's quite deep now, which is good to get ships through. But then, can they really navigate it without seeing all the landmarks they're used to? They can use GPS, but you know about Texas chicken, right? You get two tankers going in different directions, and they get real close and use their bow waves to push them apart. I'm wondering about how effective that might be with an extra few feet in that channel. Again, a lot of things can happen in a place like that. It's a small location. We have 60% of our jet fuel coming out of Houston. About 30% of our gasoline and diesel comes out of there. This is important stuff.
Absolutely. It's going to be interesting to look at this podcast, 2, 3, 4 months down the road. We'll be able to know exactly what the turnout was. But let's shift focus a little bit to something else. One of the things when you think about energy security, especially here in the U.S., is they talk about the grid's aging and it's susceptible to certain types of attacks, especially with maybe like a EMP or something like that. What are your thoughts on those types of threats on the U.S. grid?
Oh, I am very concerned about that. And I teach about that regularly and also advise on these things. I'm going to make this a bigger picture. The idea of going to nuclear war with North Korea, what do you think that has to do with electricity? Actually, it has a lot to do with electricity. Because if there are a significant amount of nuclear bombs dropped anywhere within the EMB blast radius heading toward the United States, our electricity system is going to be disrupted. I know this sounds scary for many people, but nuclear war is scary, and actually it's irrational. I worked on nuclear winter issues in the 1980s for about a year, and I asked my employer, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, I just want to get off the project. It's a nightmare. The EMBs can be also brought about by air blasts from nuclear weapons. If things get out of control, that can happen. But I'm looking at that as a low probability event because I think the leadership in North Korea is simply bluffing in order to get stuff from us and the Chinese and the Russians and others. That's what that family's been up to since the first person took charge back in the time of Stalin, and he was actually trained by the Russians. So I think we know what we're dealing with here. But here, EMPs are a real issue, and a lot of people dismiss it. I don't, because the potential effects of this, because most of our systems are not hardened, is quite significant. All it would take, for example, is a 15-year-old with a certain amount of equipment in his basement, and he could knock out a transformer station. Attacks on the physical infrastructure are significantly probable. Let's put it that way. That's not a high possibility. The most important threat so far has been cyber. And the biggest target for the cyber attackers and infrastructure is the electricity grid and electricity companies. So far, so good. There have been a couple of examples when they've had to react in ways that shut the electricity down. But the biggest threat at the electricity grid is the squirrel.
The squirrel.
And I know that sounds funny. But most of the time, let's say, for example, it wasn't a squirrel, it was a crow. Landed on a fuse right beside my house a couple of weeks ago, and the lights were out in the neighborhood and beyond. We kind of have a dumb grid, and it really is not protected against crows and squirrels. The most likely predator to attack our electricity grid is a rather dumb squirrel walking right into a transformer station. And when you hear that big pop when the lights go out, most of the time it's because of that. And maybe we should have squirrel guards or whatever. I'm not being facetious about this. This is just the way it is. Right now, that's the way it is. But once this cyber stuff starts to kick in, and most particularly when we have quantum computing, we're going to have to change the entire electricity sector protection network. Now, some people are going to think this is science fiction fantasy. It is not. This is real. There are people who want to damage our electricity grids and our oil grids and a whole bunch of other things. And they are vulnerable. Fortunately, we have great first responders, and the U.S. government, federal and states and all that, are keeping their eye on this. A lot of this has to do with human intelligence following possible threat perpetrators, I might put that in police language, and keeping an eye on them and making sure they don't do these things. But we've been lucky so far. We've been very lucky. And let's hope we remain that way. But unless we keep up with the bad guys, something's going to happen.
Well, let me ask you this. One of the things we talked about on the show is the decentralization of the grid, especially as it pertains to emerging markets where they may not even have or they have a very small centralized grid, and as it goes to these rural areas, it won't be centralized as much. Here in the U.S., obviously we have big, large power companies that are providing power to me and to you wherever we're at in the world, in the U.S. rather. But one of the things I'm curious about, you get your opinion, if we were able to transition into more of a decentralized grid, we look at smaller local units of power that were able to provide power for neighborhoods and small communities, could that fix some of those problems? So you could have a larger power company who could provide some power, backup power, if you will, but you get inside neighborhoods, you'd have a little bit more localized unit where maybe Bob down the corner has a big, nice setup and he can sell energy to folks in the neighborhood. What are your thoughts on decentralizing like that?
Well, actually, there are certain places in Texas where that already exists, but we're not to that yet. If we have a significant amount of attacks on a centralized grid that prove to be successful, having these microgrids that can actually delink automatically from a grid that's been attacked or is overheating would be the way to go. I've recommended this for Iraq before the war, of course. Nobody listened to me because the big companies wanted to send these huge generating systems to them. So your little old professor didn't get into that argument too much. That's a lot of pushing metal. And Iraq would have been a lot more secure with regard to electricity. And electricity was a big part of the insurgency. They would play the electricity networks, attack the wires, attack the pylons. When the electricity was out during the hot days, there was no AC, there was no water running, there was no water cleaning, and people got angry at the Americans. Here, if we have a significant number of attacks, then I think it would make sense to have microgrids, but let's hope that doesn't happen. But if you're out in a rural area, it makes a lot of sense to have your own microgrid. As the battery storage situation improves, and also as the prices for solar, wind, and geothermal and other renewables become lower, it's probably better to head toward that direction. Have your own microgrid for your house, even, or a neighborhood with a good backup battery storage for just in case that the lights go out.
Okay, so final question. I want to transition. We've talked about this on the show, and I would really love your opinion on this because we talked about, last time we talked about Japan and how their interests are tied up with the Middle East, and before that we talked expressly about the Middle East, but this time I want to ask you about Russia. One of the things that has come up on the show a few times is, and there's been a difference of opinion, and so the question is really, you look at Russia and how they are, I want to say bound almost, their economy is tied up in selling energy, natural gas especially, to Europe. And the European nations, some of them have said, publicly at least, that they don't want to buy from Russia, but they have to because the prices are cheaper. Some of them are saying they want to buy from the U.S. And also there's this movement that says, hey, let's build renewable energy in Europe, and then we kind of negate all of this talk, which would then effectively, on some level, hurt the Russian economy, maybe even cripple it. What are your thoughts on that? Because it seems like this is a very high-level chess game that's being played here, trying to figure out, can Russia keep their foothold to supply European energy, or will the U.S. be able to take that gap, or will the European nations be able to kind of separate from both of these countries and supply it themselves? What is your take on that?
Well, the Russians have been moving toward exporting their oil and gas to Asia and elsewhere, because they see an increasing risk in dealing with the Europeans, but still they're most reliant on Europe. Their biggest trading partner is the EU by far. Can American natural gas supplant all of Russian natural gas? No. The Russians do play a chess game. Every time it looks like a new LNG import facility is coming online, they drop the price of gas and make it less profitable. But Rotterdam's LNG import capacity right now is only at about 37 to 40%, so there's a lot of capacity there to use. We don't have the export capacity just yet to replace them, nor will we likely ever in the future. But there are other LNG exporters that are looking at that. The Russians have this pretty much wrapped up in many countries, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. They get about 100% of their gas from Russia. But another aspect of the Russian economy is it's not very diversified. And it's also not that big. I think many Americans and others think of Russia as this big, bad superpower. It's not. Their economy, their GDP is 1/8 of ours. Their GDP per capita is 1/7 of ours. And my sense of what they're doing right now and getting involved in so many places in the world, they're going to burn themselves out like they did with Star Wars and Ron Reagan, and how the Soviet Union collapsed because of their over expenditures on defense and foreign policy adventures. The Russians simply don't have the juice to compete in the long run. And if we wait them out, we win. But with regard to the European gas and oil also, the Russians export a lot of oil to Europe. It's not going to be an overnight change, and it's probably best that we do this in a smooth manner, because we really don't want the European economies to get shattered or be in difficulty because the Russians shut the gas and oil off, because this is moving too fast. But going to alternative energy sources for Europe, they know what's in the cards. As soon as we get this battery business done and we get the super batteries finished, the Russians should get very nervous, because then people will be moving more and more toward the alternative energy sources. And in Germany, they're way ahead. Now, this is like the solar capital of the EU. Germany, every time I go there, it rains. But it works because of the way their government policy is running. But this has to be done carefully, and very subtle trade-offs have to be done. There can't be sharp moves. Some people in power today think that the best way to deal with the Russians is to move sharply and aggressively at them. Historically, that has not worked. But they just don't have the juice.
Well,
I'll keep going. Sorry.
I was going to say that we've talked about this before, me and you, and I talked about the other guest, is that sometimes politicians, what they knew when they, at least what they thought they knew when they went into being politics, as far as energy policy goes, it changes on them, and they don't keep up with it. So they'll start saying stuff that you're like, yeah, we need to probably get you back up to speed on what's going on with energy policy and what should be energy policy, especially in the U.S. It seems that our politicians sometimes, that they really haven't sat down and realized the impacts of just the shale revolution and what's going on with that.
Well, it's hard. I think many of them have gotten into this, but most politicians today, as many of your listeners know, spend most of their time trying to collect money for their next re-election campaign.
Right.
There is really no debate on this stuff, except amongst a few politicians who try to keep up with this. Washington is rather dysfunctional on this and many other issues, as your listeners know. And actually, I didn't know how to properly spell dysfunction, because I really didn't have to use it until I got to Washington. It's D-Y, not D-I-S. And I know that may sound strange. Here's a professor with a Yale degree and all this, and I had no reason to use the word until I went up to the Hill and I looked at what was going on. Your listeners would be shocked at the lack of discussion on these issues. The only time they come up is when the gas price is high, and when the gas price is low, everyone shuts up and they focus on something else. But there are big strategic issues here that have to be looked at in the long run. And from my experience in Washington over 18 years, I can tell you they're not ready to think in the long run. Because for congressmen it's 2 years, for the president it's 4 years, and for senators it's 6 years. I'm thinking 50 years.
Right.
And you really need to look in that framework to understand the way this is all going to play out.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's frustrating because shows like ours and plenty of other good shows out there, we try to get in here and just try to get people a voice and try to discuss it and try to have honest, intellectual discussions about. There's plenty of people who disagree, and that's fine. We'd love to hear different opinions, and we want to discuss it and get the message out there. And you look to some of our leaders, and it's like, guys, we wish that you would just sit down and quit focusing on the next re-election and actually talk about policy that could help our country. And that's not the problem just in the U.S. It's a problem just about anywhere in the world, I'm sure. But go ahead.
Well, also, you use the term opinions. Opinions not backed up with good facts are messing up the argument. Because often you have people who are quite eloquent but know nothing. And they throw off the argument because some of them like to throw off arguments. We need to get to the facts. Remember Dragnet way back when?
Oh, yeah. I used to watch it at my grandma's house.
Just the facts, man. That's the way we should look at it. Just the facts.
Well,
and if someone goes off the factual line, stop listening to them.
And I don't disagree with that. I think the thing for me in doing the show has been that if you turn on tonight, Fox, MSNBC, or wherever you CNN, pick your 4-letter network here, and if they talk about energy policy, it's so divisive and it's so just over the top, flamboyant, just like anything else they do. It's nice to be able to get and talk to the energy professionals and hear what they're doing and understanding and learning from one another, because there's so much going on in the energy business. We just throw that term out so often. In the energy business, as you know, it touches so much of what we do on a regular day-to-day basis that it's hard to keep up and to learn about everything that's going on. And so when I say opinion, what I'm really saying is I like to hear about what's going on with the solar folks, what's going on with the nuclear folks, what's going on across the spectrum, and trying to bring that information in, because there is so many people, and we do it on this show, I think, a little bit differently, because we like to hear what people have to say and learn from them, because there's a lot of people like yourself that we can learn a lot from.
Well, I would certainly hope that the politicians and others would be listening to the professionals in the industry and the academics and all the other folks that don't have an axe to grind. And often the energy policy debate turns emotional.
Yes.
And even more emotional when people know less. And it's kind of scary for some people when someone says global warming and all the effects of it. I think part of the reaction to say it doesn't exist has a lot to do with the fear that if it does, wow, what can we do about it?
Right.
But also when it comes to the stuff we were talking about earlier in this program, the risk to our electricity and oil and gas networks and all this is serious business.
No.
This is our economy, this is our people, this is our safety, this is our health. And when things happen to the electricity system or the oil and gas system, people can lose their lives.
Absolutely. Well, for what it's worth, our number one listener, the number one place we get our downloads from is from the state of Texas, but the number four place in the world comes from Virginia. So hopefully some of those are policymakers who are listening and taking notes and learning from the wide range of professionals we have on the show, just like yourself. Now, recently, I know you've gotten on Twitter, so I want to plug that. And what else do we need to plug before we get you out of here today?
I have a LinkedIn account. I can send some articles to you, things like that. But also, if there are any senior policy people listening to this, I'd be willing to stop by your office and try to bring you up to speed if you want to. And actually, it might be better to have more of these podcasts just for the regular folks, too, because the regular folks need to push back against some of the silliness that's happening in some state capitals and in Washington. But they need to push back with facts, with the realities as one can figure them out to be. And sometimes it's complicated to figure that out. But if you're a leader of a country or of a state or a district and you go into a debate with pseudo-facts, you are not helping your people.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, Dr. Sullivan, we always appreciate your time, always enjoy the discussion, and always learn something. And we will link to your Twitter page, which you're now on and active, I see, and I've enjoyed that. And we'll link to your LinkedIn as well, so people can find you, connect with you, and follow your work. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
Very good. Thank you. And to the people of Houston, stay safe.
The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.